stripes and bright stars.
Welcome to our first legislative session Weeks in Review video. I will be producing these all session long to make sure we keep all of you, our members, up to date on all that is happening in Olympia. Well, what a first couple of weeks. The rent control bill is back and just as problematic as ever. House Bill 1217 was introduced the very first day of session, shortly followed by the Senate companion bill 5222. This bill is a virtual carbon copy of last year's rent control bill, but just as a reminder, I'll go over some of the highlights. 7% cap on rent increases, requirement for housing providers to provide a 180-day notice for any increases of 3% or more, limitation on late fees to 1.5% of the rent. It would empower local governments to establish and enforce their own regulations related to these matters. Prohibits housing providers from offering preferential terms for longer lease agreements. Limits the combined total move-in and security deposit to 1 month's rent. The legislation also extends to vacation rentals while exempting nonprofits and government-run entities. Housing providers would be held responsible for covering attorney's fees if a tenant successfully files a claim for any violation of these laws. There is an exemption for properties within the first 10 years of their certificate of occupancy. The hearing was scheduled for the first full day of session, and still our members came out in force, all united to help lawmakers understand the unintended consequences of rent control. Unfortunately, the hearing started 45 minutes late due to the opening day pomp and circumstance, which meant that only about 10 members of the public were able to testify before the Housing Committee. I, on the other hand, was able to speak to some of our Rental Housing Coalition members before the hearing about what brought them to Olympia.
I'm Corey Jalseth, and the reason that I came down to the state capitol today is to advocate for no rental caps. The issue right now is it's a supply and demand issue. Housing prices have gone up, rental prices have gone up, but to artificially instill rent control, it's not the right answer. It's been proven all across the country to be ineffective at reducing rental prices. It actually has the opposite effect because landlords, small independent housing providers, have options. And if we all sell because the threat is so real, we're going to invest in other things. There will be no more rental housing available, and what is available will be very expensive.
I oppose the bill 1217 as far as rent increases and additional fees being withheld, so that's why I'm here.
Well, the Yakima Valley Landlords Association is actively involved every year in the legislative session. We have a lot of small mom and pop landlords, and what we have realized is that these bills affect our members a great deal.
RHA members packed the hearing room and filled up 2 overflow rooms. And our signature, no-cap red shirts were all over the Capitol on the hearing day. The shirts were picked up by multiple media outlets, so your presence, everyone with the shirts on, really made a big difference. As a bill moves through the process, it has a public hearing, which is what brought everybody down to the House Housing Committee to hear the House Rent Control Bill 1217.
We also hope to build housing in the future for our community. Should the bill pass in the current form that it's in, that would preclude us from feeling comfortable in doing so.
When it comes to housing, we all agree there's a problem. We all agree that the problem in Washington State is supply. We have a massive undersupply in Washington State.
What happens next is a bill goes to executive session. This is where the legislators on that particular committee hold a session where there is no public comment to discuss the merits of a bill and whether or not to move that bill out of committee and move it along the process. Mirroring last year, the primary sponsor of the rent control bill in the House was Representative Emily Alvarado of the 34th Legislative District. An interesting wrinkle with all of this. The senator for the 34th Legislative District, Joe Wynn, has been appointed by Governor Ferguson to run the Washington State Department of Commerce. That left an opening for the Senate seat in this district. Legislative appointments are handled by the county council where the district resides, in this case, King County Council. So hang on to that thought for a minute, we'll come back to it. So several days later, the House Housing Committee held an executive session where, again, as I said, no public comment is allowed, but members of the committee discussed whether to advance the bill out of their committee. And here are Representatives Barkas and Defoe speaking against this bill.
But in the entirety of this bill, in order to have fairness, you have to have parity. In order to do that, you have to recognize both sides of the equation. I've said it before, you cannot have tenants without housing providers. This bill is one-sided, to say the least. But we can do better. We can talk about tenant assistance. We can talk about predatory rent increases. We can talk about eviction reform. And we can talk about more supply to truly get at this problem.
Because the small rental housing provider can no longer afford to run their business because they've been pushed out of the market by the Washington State Legislature and policies that have come out of this place for the last 6 years. Rent control does not work. It has never worked. Look at any jurisdiction across the country where rent control has been imposed. You will see a decrease in supply. This will not only cause small landlords to leave the market, it will cause big investors to leave the market, and they will go to other states.
Now stay with me here for a 3-day timeline. The bill is moved out of the House Housing Committee on Monday, as we just heard. It was moved out of committee by only one vote, with Democrat Representative Addison Richards being the only no vote from the Democrats.
Representative Richards?
Representative Richards votes nay.
Stay with me here. We're going to go back to Representative Emily Alvarado, the primary sponsor of the rent control bill in the House. The House bill was moved out of the committee on Monday. Then Tuesday night, the King County Council had their council meeting where...
Raise your right hand. I, Emily Alvarado.
I, Emily Alvarado.
Do solemnly swear.
Representative Emily Alvarado was promoted to Senator Emily Alvarado for the 34th Legislative District. Now finally, Wednesday, the Senate rent control bill, the primary sponsor being Senator Yasmin Trudeau, is heard in the Senate Housing Committee. And who do you think walks into the hearing room? Now Senator Emily Alvarado, who will be able to cast a vote for the Senate version of the rent control bill. But I digress. The Senate hearing was much more by the book, and many RHAC members were able to testify in the full hour and 30 minutes that was allotted to public testimony. It was a busy first 2 weeks. The House version of the rent control bill will now head to the Appropriations Committee, and we will wait to see where the Senate version of the bill moves as well. We are also hoping to see bills that RHA helped draft that were mentioned by Representative Barkas in his remarks. Our Tenant Assistance Program Bill, or TAP, Tenant Safety and Eviction Reform Bill, and our Harmonization of Rental Housing Laws Bill. Thank you again to all our members who made the trip to Olympia to make their presence known and to speak directly to lawmakers about how this legislation will affect housing in Washington. Make sure to keep an eye on your inboxes and social media platforms for all 2025 legislative session updates.